I remember that night with the kind of clarity that comes only from moments that split your life in two. Before and after. The living room was dim, lit only by the blue glow of the television and the soft amber light from the kitchen spilling through the doorway. My mother's house had always felt frozen in time, but that night it felt especially heavy with the weight of all the years that had passed since Marcus and I had sat in these same spots as teenagers. The popcorn in the bowl on my lap had gone cold hours ago. I'd barely touched it, too aware of Marcus stretched out on the opposite end of the couch, his long legs folded beneath him in that careless way he'd always had. Even at 30, he moved through the world like he still believed it wouldn't hurt him. I envied that about him. I always had. We were watching The Ring because Marcus had insisted. For old time's sake, he said, grinning that crooked smile that had gotten us both into trouble more times than I could count. You used to hide behind the pillows, he reminded me, and I'd laugh because what else could I do? I couldn't tell him that I wasn't the same person who used to hide behind pillows. I couldn't tell him that the person I'd become in the city was someone he'd never met. The movie played on, but I wasn't really watching it. I was watching him instead, the way the television light played across his face, highlighting the stubble he'd been growing since his divorce. The way his fingers drummed absently against his knee. The way he'd glance at me sometimes when he thought I wasn't looking, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. Then it happened. The jump scare we'd both been expecting but had somehow forgotten to brace for. The sudden crash of sound, the flash of pale face on the screen, and Marcus's hand shot out instinctively, his fingers wrapping around my forearm like he was drowning, and I was the only thing keeping him afloat. Time stretched. His grip was firm, warm, and completely unnecessary because the scare was already over. But he didn't let go. His thumb pressed against the inside of my wrist where my pulse was hammering, and I wondered if he could feel it. I wondered if he knew what it meant. I didn't move. Couldn't move. My entire world had narrowed to the points where his skin touched mine, to the way his breathing had changed, to the space between us that suddenly felt charged with something I'd spent 15 years trying to forget. When he finally released me, the laughter that burst from his lips was too loud, too sharp. It filled the room like broken glass, and I knew he felt it too. Whatever this was, whatever had always been there, humming beneath the surface of our friendship like a live wire. I just watched him, my heart still racing, while he turned back to the screen and pretended nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that made the air between us different, made every breath feel deliberate. The movie ended eventually. Marcus made jokes about how we'd gotten soft, how we used to be braver. I smiled and nodded and walked him to the door, and when he hugged me goodbye, I held on just a second too long. He noticed. I could tell by the way he hesitated on the porch, like he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Later, alone in my childhood bedroom with its faded basketball posters and the twin bed I'd outgrown a decade ago, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds of settling wood and my mother's soft snoring down the hall. But my mind was anything but quiet. I kept replaying the moment. The weight of his hand. The way he'd looked at me afterward. The silence that had felt like a question neither of us knew how to ask. My arm still tingled where he'd touched me, and I pressed my fingers to the spot, trying to hold onto the sensation. Trying to understand why. After all these years, after building a whole life away from this place, I felt like I was 16 again, drowning in feelings I wasn't supposed to have for my best friend. I turned onto my side and closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself wondering what would have happened if I hadn't been so careful all those years ago. If I'd been brave enough to reach back. I hadn't planned to stay this long. 3 days had stretched into a week, and now it was going on 2. My mother's heart episode had been minor, the doctors assured us, but it had shaken something loose in me. Something that made my apartment in the city feel impossibly far away, like it belonged to someone else entirely. The house hadn't changed much in the years since I'd moved away. Same wallpaper in the kitchen, same creaky third step on the stairs, same family photos arranged along the mantel like a timeline of a life I'd mostly left behind. There I was at 8, gap-toothed and grass-stained after a soccer game. At 16, Marcus's arm slung over my shoulder at graduation, both of us squinting into the sun and grinning like we owned the world. I catch myself staring at that photo sometimes, remembering how easy everything had seemed then. How simple it was to be Julian Hayes, star midfielder, decent student, the kind of son who dated nice girls and never gave his parents reason to worry. The version of myself I'd built in the city felt like a different person entirely. Quieter, more honest. But here, in this house where I'd learned to hide so well, I could feel myself slipping back into old patterns. Marcus had appeared on the second day, showing up at the door with a casserole from his mother and that same crooked smile that had gotten us through high school. He looked older, of course, lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a weariness in his shoulders that spoke of too many long days at the hardware store his father had left him. But his laugh was the same, and the way he ruffled his hair when he was nervous, and the particular brand of chaos he brought with him wherever he went. He'd never left town. That fact hung between us like something solid, though neither of us acknowledged it directly. While I'd been building a life 200 miles away, learning who I was when no one was watching, Marcus had stayed. Married Sarah from our English class, bought a house 3 streets over from where we'd grown up, settled into the kind of quiet suburban life we'd once sworn we'd escape. The divorce had been finalized 2 years ago, he told me over coffee on day 3. Said it like it was just another piece of news, the way you might mention the weather or the score of last night's game. But I could see something guarded in his expression when he said it, the same look he used to get when his father would drink too much and start shouting. No one talks about why, he added, stirring sugar into his cup with more focus than the task required. It was just time. I wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his voice told me not to push. Instead, we fell into the comfortable rhythms we'd perfected as teenagers. Video games on the ancient console in my old bedroom. Takeout containers balanced on our knees while we argued about movies we'd seen a dozen times. Late-night drives through neighborhoods we knew by heart, past the elementary school where we'd met, the park where we'd spent countless summer afternoons, the lake where we'd learned to drive in his father's pickup truck. But something was different now. I noticed the way Marcus looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, something searching in his gaze that made my chest tighten. The way he'd ask careful questions about my life in the city, about work and friends, and whether I was seeing anyone, then go quiet when I gave him answers that revealed more than I intended. I'd come out slowly in the city, not with any grand announcement, but through a series of small admissions to co-workers and neighbors who didn't know me as anything other than the person I was becoming. It felt like breathing underwater and finally surfacing, like discovering I'd been holding my breath for years without realizing it. But I'd never told Marcus. Never told anyone from home, really. I'd assumed it didn't matter, that the distance between my 2 lives was protection enough. Now, sitting across from him in diners we'd frequented as kids, I wondered if that had been a mistake. If the silence I'd maintained had cost us something I couldn't get back. The house was full of ghosts during those long evenings when Marcus would leave, and I'd be alone with my mother's quiet breathing and the familiar sounds of a place that had never quite fit right. My old closet still held clothes from high school, jerseys and Letterman jackets that belonged to someone I'd been pretending to be. Yearbooks filled with messages from classmates who'd known only the version of me I'd been willing to show them. I found my old journals one night, buried beneath a box of trophies I'd never bothered to take with me. Page after page of careful handwriting, 17-year-old me documenting crushes on girls I'd never really wanted to kiss, plans for a future that looked nothing like the life I'd actually built. Between the lines, if you knew how to read them, were all the things I'd been too afraid to write down. The way I'd watch Marcus during practice, the dreams that left me confused and ashamed, the growing certainty that I was different in ways that mattered. I was 30 years old and still afraid of some of those silences. Still afraid of the boy I'd been, and the wants I'd spent so long learning to ignore. Marcus seemed lonelier than he wanted to admit, I realized as the days passed. There was something hollow in his laughter sometimes, a kind of emptiness in the spaces between his words. He'd mention his ex-wife with a careful neutrality that felt practiced, like he'd rehearsed not caring. He'd talk about the store and his routine and the quiet predictability of his days, and I'd hear the question he wasn't asking. On Friday night, we ended up back in my mother's living room, the scene of that first night's revelation. The same couch, the same dim lighting. But this time, Marcus chose the spot right next to me instead of the opposite end. Close enough that I could smell his cologne, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. We weren't watching a horror movie this time. Just some mindless action film neither of us was really following. But I was acutely aware of every shift of his body, every time his knee bumped against mine, every moment when the space between us seemed to shrink and expand like something alive. When the credits rolled, neither of us moved to leave. It was Marcus who suggested the next movie night. He called on Tuesday, his voice carrying that particular casualness that meant he'd been thinking about it for a while before picking up the phone. Just like old times, he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice even through the static. Remember how you used to hide behind the pillows? I agreed before I could think better of it, though something in the way he said it made my chest tighten. There was an edge to his tone, something almost testing, like he was waiting to see how I'd respond. Like those words meant more than they should have. When Friday came, he arrived with a bottle of whiskey tucked under his arm and that same crooked smile, but there was something different in his eyes. A kind of nervous energy that reminded me of how he used to get before big games, all coiled anticipation and barely contained movement. He'd chosen another horror movie, something we'd never seen, but I suspected we both knew we wouldn't be paying much attention to the screen. This time, he didn't even pretend to sit at the other end of the couch. He settled next to me, close enough that our shoulders brushed when he reached for the bottle to pour whiskey into the coffee mugs my mother had left out. The amber liquid burned going down, but it was nothing compared to the heat of having him so close, the familiar scent of his cologne mixing with something else, something that might have been anticipation. We talked over the film from the beginning, our voices low in the darkened room. About high school and teachers we'd hated and friends we'd lost touch with. About the way the town had changed and the way it had stayed exactly the same. About regrets, though we were careful not to name them directly. The whiskey made us both bolder, or maybe it just gave us permission to say things we'd been thinking for weeks. I found myself telling him about the girls I'd dated in high school, how I tried so hard to feel what I was supposed to feel. Sarah Morrison with her perfect smile and patient hands. Jennifer Walsh who'd waited 3 months for me to try to kiss her properly. I was trying so hard to be normal, I heard myself say, the words coming out before I could stop them. The whiskey had made them slippery, honest in ways that scared me. Marcus went very still beside me. When I looked at him, there was something sharp and vulnerable in his eyes, something that reminded me of the way he used to look when his father would criticize his grades or his choices or the way he threw a baseball. "Weren't we all?" he said quietly, and those 3 words hung in the air between us like a confession. I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. But something shifted in that moment. Some wall that had been carefully maintained for 15 years developing the first hairline crack. We finished the movie in a different kind of silence, one that felt heavy with possibility and terror in equal measure. After that night, everything changed in small ways that added up to something significant. Marcus started texting more often, casual messages about nothing that felt like everything. "Saw your mom at the grocery store? She looks good. Remember that teacher who used to make us run laps? Heard he retired. Thought you'd want to know." He'd drop by unannounced, always with some excuse. Fixing the loose step on the porch, bringing over groceries he claimed he'd bought too much of, suggesting late-night walks around the neighborhood because he couldn't sleep. I began to realize he was studying me, asking careful questions about my life in the city that felt like he was trying to map the person I'd become when he wasn't watching. The questions grew more direct as the days passed. "What's your apartment like? Do you have friends there? Are you happy?" And always circling back to the same territory. "Are you seeing anyone?" The first few times he asked, I deflected with jokes or changed the subject. But there was something persistent in the way he kept coming back to it. Something that made me wonder what answer he was hoping for. It was on a Thursday night, almost 2 weeks after that second movie night, when he suggested driving out to the lake. "Just like we used to," he said, but there was nothing casual about the way he said it. We took his truck, the same model as the one his father had owned when we were kids, and drove the familiar roads in comfortable silence. The lake looked exactly the same as it had 15 years ago, dark water reflecting the stars and the distant lights of town. We sat in the truck bed like we had as teenagers, our legs dangling over the tailgate, sharing a beer and pretending to watch the sky. But I could feel the weight of his attention, the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. There was something he wanted to say, some question he was working up the courage to ask. Finally, after we'd been sitting there for almost an hour, he cleared his throat. "So are you? Seeing anyone, I mean?" The question hung between us, and I knew this was a moment that mattered. That whatever I said next would change something fundamental between us. I thought about the men I'd dated in the city, the careful relationships that had never quite worked, the way I'd always held something back without knowing why. "No," I said simply. "I'm not." He nodded, like he'd been expecting that answer, but I saw the way his shoulders relaxed slightly. He didn't ask why, didn't push for details. Just sat there beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. When I looked down, I noticed his hand resting on the metal between us, palm up, fingers slightly curled. Not quite touching mine, but close enough that if I wanted to, if I was brave enough, I could bridge that gap with barely any movement at all. I stared at that hand for a long time, memorizing the calluses from work, the scar across his knuckles from a childhood accident I remembered, wondering what would happen if I reached out, wondering if he was wondering the same thing. But in the end, neither of us moved. We just sat there under the stars, with all the things we couldn't say yet humming in the space between us, and his hand resting like an invitation I wasn't quite ready to accept. I called my boss Monday morning and asked for another week off. "Family emergency," I said, which wasn't entirely a lie. My mother was doing fine, her color better, her energy returning to normal. But something in me wasn't ready to leave yet, wasn't ready to return to the careful life I'd built 200 miles away. I told myself it was about being a good son, about making sure she was really okay before I abandoned her again. But late at night, lying in my childhood bed, I knew better. I was staying for Marcus, for whatever was building between us in these quiet moments, for the possibility that maybe, finally, we might stop pretending. He seemed to sense the shift before I told him. When I mentioned I'd be staying longer, he just nodded like he'd been expecting it, but I caught the way his shoulders relaxed, the small smile he tried to hide, like he'd been holding his breath and could finally exhale. After that, he became a constant presence. He'd show up in the mornings with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, claiming he'd bought too many again. He'd find reasons to linger, small repairs around the house that my mother had been meaning to get done for months. The leaky faucet in the kitchen, the loose board on the back steps, the squeaky hinge on the screen door that had been annoying us both since we were kids. I'd watch him work, the easy competence of his hands, the way he'd gotten broader through the shoulders since high school. He'd catch me looking sometimes and grin, making some joke about how I'd never been handy with tools, and I'd laugh, because it was easier than examining why I couldn't seem to look away. Our conversations grew different during those extended days. Quieter, more careful, like we were both aware we were approaching something we couldn't take back. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, sharing a beer and talking about everything except what was really happening between us. But the silences started to feel more significant than the words, loaded with all the things we weren't quite ready to say. It was during one of those quiet evenings that Marcus suggested we watch Rear Window. He'd brought over the DVD, holding it up with an almost shy smile. "Classic," he said. Figured it was time we watched something that wasn't trying to give us heart attacks. We settled onto the couch, and this time there was no pretense about where we sat. Marcus took his place next to me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his leg against mine, close enough that when he shifted his weight, his shoulder pressed briefly against my arm. The movie played, black and white shadows dancing across our faces, but I was more aware of Marcus than I was of James Stewart's paranoid photographer. Aware of the way he breathed, the small sounds he made when something on screen amused him, the weight of his attention when I could feel him watching me instead of the film. It happened during a quiet moment in the movie, nothing dramatic or startling. Marcus reached for his beer on the coffee table, and when he settled back, his hand came to rest on the couch between us. Not touching me, but close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin. I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did, some unconscious shifting that brought us closer together until his knuckles brushed against mine. Just barely, the slightest contact, but it sent electricity through my entire body. This time, neither of us pulled away. We sat like that for the rest of the movie, hands barely touching, both of us pretending to watch the screen while hyper-aware of every small movement, every shared breath. When the credits rolled, we still didn't move. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and fear. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat and said something about getting home, but his voice sounded rougher than usual. When he stood, his fingers lingered on mine for just a moment longer than necessary, a whisper of pressure that felt like a promise. That night, I dreamed of us as teenagers. We were in the locker room after practice, steam rising from the showers, the sound of water echoing off tile walls. In the dream, we were the only ones left, standing by our lockers in nothing but towels, and when I looked up, Marcus was watching me with an expression I'd never seen before. Hungry and scared and hopeful all at once. In the dream, I didn't look away. In the dream, I took a step toward him. I woke breathless, my heart hammering, the phantom touch of dream fingers still burning on my skin. It took me several minutes to remember where I was, to separate the want in my chest from the boy I'd been and the man I'd become. I couldn't get back to sleep after that. Instead, I found myself digging through the drawer of my old desk until I found a notebook, pages yellow with age but still blank. I'd kept journals in high school, a habit I'd abandoned when I left for college. But something about being back in this room, in this headspace, made me want to write again. I think I'm still waiting for him to admit what we both already know. I wrote in the dim light from the street lamp outside my window. The words felt dangerous on the page, more real than they'd been when they were just thoughts in my head. My mother noticed something was different. She didn't ask directly, but I'd catch her watching me sometimes with that particular look mothers get when they're trying to figure out their children. She'd make small comments about how rested I looked, how the city stress seemed to be leaving my face. One evening, as she folded laundry in the living room while I pretended to read, she said quietly, "You look more like yourself than you used to." I glanced up from my book, startled. "What do you mean?" She didn't look at me, just continued smoothing wrinkles from one of my father's old shirts. "More settled," she said, "like you're not fighting something all the time." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. But her words stayed with me, echoing in my mind as I tried to understand what was happening to me in this place I'd spent so long trying to escape. The breakthrough came the following weekend. Marcus had suggested another drive to the lake, and this time I didn't hesitate to say yes. We'd been doing this dance for weeks now, circling around each other, touching and pulling back, speaking in subtext and loaded silences. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like broken glass. We sat in our usual spot in the truck bed, but something felt different, more charged. Marcus seemed restless, shifting his weight, running his hands through his hair in that nervous gesture I'd known since we were kids. Finally, he turned to look at me directly, and there was something raw in his expression that made my breath catch. "I think about you too much," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what to do with that." The words hung between us, honest and terrifying and impossibly brave. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it, but I didn't look away. Couldn't look away. This was the moment I'd been waiting for without knowing it, the confession that changed everything. I didn't answer him with words. I couldn't have, even if I'd known what to say. But I didn't look away either, didn't dismiss it or make a joke or pretend I didn't understand what he meant. Instead, I just held his gaze and let him see that I understood, that I'd been thinking about him too much too, that whatever this was, whatever we were becoming, I wasn't going to run from it anymore. We sat there under the stars, the weight of his admission settling between us like something precious and fragile, and for the first time in weeks, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. The rain started just after lunch on a Tuesday, the kind of steady downpour that settles in for hours and makes the whole world feel smaller, more intimate. Marcus had come by that morning to help my mother with some boxes in the attic, but the weather had driven us indoors, leaving us sitting at the kitchen table with nothing to do but listen to the drumming against the windows. My mother had gone to take a nap, claiming the rain made her sleepy, but I suspected she was giving us space. She'd been doing that more often lately, finding reasons to leave Marcus and me alone together, as if she could sense something shifting between us that we hadn't named yet. The power went out around 3, taking with it the steady hum of the refrigerator and the soft background noise of the television in the living room. The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the rain and the settling sounds of the old house. We found candles in the kitchen drawer, the same emergency stash my mother had kept there for as long as I could remember. Marcus lit them with practiced ease, placing them around the table until we were surrounded by a warm circle of flickering light that made everything beyond our small space disappear. There was something about the candlelight, the isolation of the storm, that made the air between us feel different, more charged, like we'd been transported somewhere outside of normal time, where the careful boundaries we'd maintained for weeks no longer applied. We talked about small things at first. The storm, the way the town looked different in the rain, memories of other power outages from when we were kids. But gradually, our conversation grew more personal, more honest, as if the darkness gave us permission to say things we'd been holding back. I found myself telling him about the city, about the person I'd become there, about learning to be honest about who I was, about the slow process of accepting parts of myself I'd spent years trying to ignore. And then, before I could stop myself, I was telling him about the first boy I'd kissed. It was in a bar near my apartment, I said, watching the candlelight flicker across Marcus's face. A stranger, someone whose name I never learned. I'd been so nervous I could barely speak, but when it happened, it didn't feel like what I thought it would. It felt like breathing for the first time. Marcus went very still, his eyes fixed on the flame between us. I could see something working behind his expression, some internal struggle playing out in the shadows and light. Then he said, quietly, "I used to dream about you. I thought it would go away." The words hung in the air between us, and I felt something inside my chest crack open. All these weeks of careful dancing around each other, all these years of wondering and wanting and never quite knowing, and there it was. The truth, simple and devastating and beautiful. I reached across the table, my hand shaking slightly, and covered his with my own. His skin was warm, familiar, and when his fingers turned to interlock with mine, it felt like something falling into place that had been waiting to align for 15 years. We sat like that for a long time, just holding hands across the table while the rain drummed against the windows and the candles cast dancing shadows on the walls. I could hear our breathing, synchronized and careful, and feel the weight of 100 unsaid things swelling in the space between us. Then Marcus leaned forward, his free hand reaching up to touch my face, his thumb brushing across my cheek with a gentleness that made my heart stutter. When he kissed me, it wasn't dramatic or desperate like in the movies. It was hesitant and soft and shaking with nervousness and hope and 15 years of wanting. It wasn't perfect. Our noses bumped, and I could taste the coffee we'd been drinking. And there was a moment where we both pulled back slightly, startled by our own boldness. But it was real. More real than anything had been in a very long time. When we broke apart, we just stared at each other for a moment, both of us breathing hard, both of us looking slightly stunned by what had just happened. Then, without speaking, we moved to the living room, settling onto the couch side by side, our shoulders touching, our hands still intertwined. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was full, pregnant with possibility and change, and the weight of a barrier finally broken. I felt like every version of myself I'd ever been was watching from somewhere, just out of sight. The boy who'd hidden his feelings behind girlfriends and sports and careful normalcy. The teenager who'd lain awake at night thinking about his best friend. The man who'd built a life in the city but had never stopped wondering what if. Outside, the storm continued, But inside our small circle of candlelight, everything had changed. Marcus eventually broke the silence, his voice rough with emotion. What does this mean? It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since that first night when he'd grabbed my arm during the movie. What did it mean, this thing that had been building between us? What did it mean for our friendship, for our lives, for the careful stories we'd told ourselves about who we were? I turned to look at him, taking in the familiar features made strange and new by candlelight and the intimacy of what had just passed between us. His eyes were uncertain, hopeful, scared, all at once. I think it means we stop pretending, I said finally, and the words felt like both an answer and a beginning. He nodded slowly, his thumb tracing circles on the back of my hand. The gesture was absent, unconscious, but it sent warmth spreading through my entire body. We stayed there until the power came back on, until the sudden brightness of the overhead lights forced us back into the ordinary world. But something fundamental had shifted. The careful distance we'd maintained was gone, replaced by something fragile and precious and terrifying. When Marcus finally left that evening, he kissed me again at the door, brief and soft but deliberate, like he was claiming something, or maybe like he was making a promise. After he was gone, I sat in my childhood bedroom and wrote in the notebook I'd started keeping. The words came easily now, flowing like water after a dam has broken. Everything is different, I wrote. Everything is the same. But for the first time in my life, those two things don't feel like a contradiction. Reality has a way of intruding on perfect moments, and ours came crashing back with the morning sun. The days after our kiss were different, charged with a new awareness that made every interaction feel significant. But they were also complicated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus would come by as usual, but there was a carefulness to him now, a hyper-awareness of who might be watching, who might notice the way we looked at each other or stood a little too close. I started to understand what 15 years in a small town meant, what it cost to be known by everyone, and have your life be public property. Marcus had grown up here, built his reputation here, failed at marriage here where everyone could see. The weight of all those watching eyes was something I'd forgotten in my years away. It showed in small ways at first. The way he'd step back when my mother came into the room, putting careful distance between us. How he'd avoid eye contact when we ran into people at the grocery store or the diner, introducing me as his old friend Julian, who was visiting, nothing more. The way his whole body would tense when I'd reach for his hand without thinking, a quick flinch that told me everything I needed to know about how far we could go in public. I tried to be understanding. This was new territory for both of us, and I knew better than anyone how scary it could be to live authentically when you'd spent so long hiding. But there was something in his behavior that reminded me too much of my teenage self, the version of me who dated girls I didn't want and played roles that never fit right. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. We'd gone to Murphy's Diner for dinner, something we'd done dozens of times over the years. But this time, everything felt different. Marcus sat across from me in the booth, his hands carefully placed on the table, his eyes scanning the room like he was cataloging who was there, who might see us together. When I reached across to touch his fingers, just briefly, he pulled back so quickly it was like I'd burned him. I saw you, I wanted to say. I saw the real you, and now you're hiding again. But I didn't say it, not there. Instead, I ate my burger in silence while Marcus made forced conversation about work and the weather, his voice too bright, too careful. Like we were strangers making small talk instead of two people who'd finally found the courage to stop pretending. Walking back to his truck afterward, I tried once more. I leaned closer as we approached the parking lot, drawn by the familiar scent of his cologne and the memory of his lips on mine. But he stepped away, his eyes darting toward the diner windows, toward the people who might be watching. That's when I knew. I spent that night packing, folding clothes I'd barely unpacked weeks ago, gathering the pieces of the life I'd put on hold to figure out what was happening between us. My mother found me in the morning, suitcase open on the bed, and didn't ask questions. Just gave me a long look and said she understood. Marcus called around noon, his voice tight with something that might have been panic. He'd heard from my mother that I was leaving. Could we talk? Could we have dinner one more time? I agreed, though part of me knew it was a mistake. We met at his house this time, away from the watching eyes of the town. He'd cooked, something simple but careful, and opened a bottle of wine like this was a celebration instead of an ending. But I could see the strain in his shoulders, the way he avoided looking directly at me as we sat down to eat. The meal passed in stilted conversation, both of us dancing around what we really needed to say. Marcus talked about work, about his plans for the weekend, about anything except the fact that I was leaving or why. He stared at his plate like it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I won't be your secret," I said, setting down my fork. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried the weight of everything I'd learned about myself in the years since I'd left this place. Marcus went very still, his fork halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, deliberately, but still didn't look at me. I waited for him to say something, to argue or explain or even get angry. But he just sat there, staring at his plate like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud in the quiet kitchen. I pulled on my jacket, the same one I'd worn to so many of our meetings over the past few weeks, and headed toward the door. Marcus didn't follow, didn't call my name, or ask me to stay or promise to try harder. He just sat there at his kitchen table, surrounded by the careful life he'd built, and let me walk away. I drove back to my mother's house with tears in my eyes and my heart feeling like it was breaking all over again. Not just for what we'd lost, but for the boy Marcus still was somewhere deep down, too scared to reach for what he wanted. But the next morning, before the sun was even up, I found him sitting on the porch steps. He was holding something in his hands, several sheets of paper covered in his familiar handwriting. When he saw me through the screen door, he didn't smile or wave, just held up the pages like an offering. I took the letter from him without a word and read it sitting in my car in the driveway while he waited on the porch. Page after page of memories I'd forgotten and feelings he'd never shared. About watching me play soccer and wishing he could touch my hand. About his wedding day and thinking of me. About the night I'd first come back to town and how he'd gone home and cried because he'd thought he was overwanting something he couldn't have. "I'm sorry," he'd written at the end. "I'm sorry for being a coward. I'm sorry for making you feel like something shameful when you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. I don't know how to be brave, but I want to learn." By the time I finished reading, my face was wet with tears and my hands were shaking. I called his number, but it went straight to voicemail. I tried again an hour later, then again after lunch. Finally, just as I was loading my suitcase into the car, my phone buzzed with a text message. "If you come back, I'll try. I don't want to be afraid anymore." I stared at those words for a long time, sitting in my mother's driveway with the engine running and my whole life packed into 2 bags. Part of me wanted to turn the car off, go back inside, wait for him to be ready. But I knew that wasn't how it worked. Some things you had to choose for yourself, and Marcus had to decide who he wanted to be without me there to make it easier. So I drove away, carrying his words with me like a promise that might never be kept, but was precious anyway. Months passed before I stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed, hoping it might be him. I settled back into my life in the city with a strange kind of peace. My apartment felt different when I returned, smaller somehow, but also more authentically mine. I'd left something behind in that small town, some version of myself that had been waiting for permission to want what I wanted. Coming back without it felt like shedding skin. I threw myself into work, took up running again, started dating someone named David who was kind and uncomplicated and everything that made sense on paper. But even as I tried to move forward, part of me remained suspended in that candlelit kitchen, in the weight of Marcus's hand in mine, in the possibility of something I'd never quite gotten to fully experience. The first postcard arrived on a Tuesday in October. No return address, but I recognized his handwriting immediately. It was a picture of the lake where we used to sit in his truck bed, the same view we'd looked at countless times as teenagers and again as adults finally learning to be honest with each other. There was nothing written on the back, just my address and his careful script. More came over the following weeks. The diner where we'd had our last dinner. The high school where we'd met. The hardware store where he worked. Each one wordless, but heavy with memory and meaning. I kept them in a shoebox on my kitchen counter, unsure what they meant, but unable to throw them away. David noticed them eventually, asked who was sending me pictures of places that looked like nowhere. I told him they were from an old friend, which was true enough. But the careful way I said it must have given something away, because he looked at me with the particular expression people get when they realize they're competing with a ghost. We broke up on a Sunday in November, amicably, and with the kind of mutual understanding that comes when both people know someone's heart isn't fully available. He deserved better than someone who was still carrying postcards from another life, and I wasn't ready to pretend otherwise. Winter came early that year, and with it a kind of restless energy I couldn't shake. I found myself walking the city streets for hours, thinking about small towns and the weight of history, about the difference between hiding and waiting, about what it meant to choose yourself over love, or if that's even what I'd done. Then, on a Thursday evening in March, I climbed the stairs to my apartment and found him there. Marcus was sitting on the steps outside my door, still wearing his work clothes, looking exactly like himself and completely out of place at the same time. When he saw me, he didn't smile or stand or offer any explanation for how he'd gotten my address or why he'd driven 200 miles without calling first. He just looked at me with those familiar brown eyes and said, "Hey." I sat down beside him on the narrow step, our shoulders touching in the same unconscious way they had when we were 17, and the world was full of possibilities we were too scared to name. The hallway was quiet except for the distant sound of someone's television and the steady rhythm of our breathing. We stayed like that until the sun went down, painting the grimy hallway window gold, and then fading to the purple gray of city dusk. Neither of us spoke. There was too much to say and not enough words, too much time passed, and not nearly enough. When full darkness finally came, I stood and unlocked my apartment door. Marcus followed me inside without being asked, taking in the space I'd built for myself with the same careful attention he'd always given to things that mattered to him. I put the kettle on and found 2 mugs, the ritual of tea-making giving my hands something to do while my heart figured out how to beat normally again. Marcus sat at my small kitchen table, and I could feel him watching me move around the space, learning the geography of the life I'd built without him. When I set the mugs down and took the chair across from him, he was staring at his hands. Then, without looking up, he began to work his wedding ring off his finger. It stuck slightly at the knuckle, worn thin by years of nervous twisting, before finally sliding free. He placed it on the table between us with a small click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. I stared at that ring, that small circle of gold that had been part of him for so long I'd stopped noticing it. Now, sitting on my table next to our cooling tea, it looked like what it was, a symbol of someone he used to be, someone he decided he didn't want to be anymore. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Some conversations happen in silence, in the space between what was and what might be. When we finally went to bed, it was to sleep, nothing more. Marcus curled up on my couch like he belonged there, and I lay in my bedroom listening to the unfamiliar sound of someone else breathing in my space, wondering what morning would bring. The story doesn't end here. There are conversations still to be had, decisions to be made, the long work of building something real from the ruins of what we'd both been too afraid to want. But lying there in the dark, listening to Marcus sleep in my living room, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope, quiet and fragile, but real. For now, that was enough.